Consider the grain that became your morning bread, the new car sitting in a dealer's lot, or the flood of goods that arrived at a port from the far side of the ocean. Before almost any of it reached you, it very likely crossed a vast stretch of the continent on steel rails, aboard a freight train you never saw and never thought about. The largest freight railroad in America hauls a staggering share of that unseen cargo. It is called Union Pacific, and this is a series about the companies that run the world. Union Pacific represents a heavy and deeply physical kind of power. It does not make the goods it carries. It hauls them in enormous quantities across half a continent, and in doing so, it forms part of the great circulatory system of an entire economy, the arteries along which the heaviest things flow. Consider what rides on those rails: grain and coal, chemicals and lumber, brand new automobiles, and the great stacked containers lifted straight off the ships arriving from Asia. It is the heavy, bulky, unglamorous freight that almost nothing else can move so cheaply or in such quantity. And the efficiency is remarkable. A single long freight train can carry the load of several hundred trucks while burning far less fuel for every ton it moves. For heavy goods traveling over land, there has never been a cheaper or cleaner way to move them than steel wheels on steel rail. The scale of it is easy to miss. America's freight railroads together move close to 40% of the nation's long-distance freight, measured by the weight carried over distance, and yet almost the entire public passes their whole lives never really seeing it happen. Union Pacific itself was stitched into the country's very origins. It was built in the 19th century as part of the first transcontinental railroad, the iron spine that bound a young nation together, and over the following century and a half it grew by steadily absorbing one rival line after another. Today its territory is immense. Union Pacific covers the western two-thirds of the United States, its tracks running out to the Pacific ports, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and across the great crossings into Mexico itself. It is less a company than a piece of national geography. And here lies the true moat, which is the ground itself. The real fortress is the right-of-way, the routes and the rails laid down painstakingly over 150 years. No one will ever again build a second continental rail network from scratch. It simply cannot be replicated at any price. This gives rise to a striking situation. A factory, a mine, or a grain elevator sitting on Union Pacific's line very often has no other railroad it can use at all. It is, in the language of the industry, a captive shipper, and that captivity hands the railroad enormous power over the price it charges. Nor is the map open to newcomers. North American rail has been carved into a few enormous territories. In the west, Union Pacific duels with its great rival BNSF, while in the east, CSX and Norfolk Southern hold sway. Each is, on its own ground, very nearly a monopoly. This is the fruit of a long consolidation. Over many decades, dozens upon dozens of separate railroads merged and merged again until only a handful of giants remained, a set of regional monopolies watched over, rather lightly, by the regulators. In recent years, these giants have squeezed hard. Chasing ever higher profits, they have run longer and longer trains with fewer and fewer workers, a discipline that made them immensely profitable, but that has strained service and drawn bitter complaints from the very shippers who have nowhere else to turn. So we reach the question this series always asks of what would break if Union Pacific vanished. The entire Western supply chain would cease. Grain could not reach the ports, coal could not reach the power plants, and containers would pile up uselessly on the docks. The nation's trucks could not absorb even a fraction of that load, and the economy would swiftly choke. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. We have allowed the very arteries of a continent's commerce to become a small number of private monopolies from which their captive customers simply cannot escape. Is it truly wise that so much of a nation's trade should ride on tracks owned by so very few? To be fair, and it genuinely deserves saying, to move the heaviest goods across an entire continent cheaply and cleanly and day after day is a quiet marvel of engineering and organization. Without the railroads, the highways would choke solid and the cost of very nearly everything we buy would climb. And that is the deeper lesson of this particular giant. The deepest moat of all is a network that can never be rebuilt. own the only road across the land, the single path that everything heavy must travel, and each thing that crosses it must, in the end, pay you a toll. So the next time a long freight train goes rumbling past a crossing and you find yourself counting its endless cars, think of the grain and the coal and the containers riding across a continent on rails first laid a century ago. And think of the quiet giant that owns the road beneath them all.